Welcome to the complete guide to Ragnaros Heroic. This is the last fight of Firelands and arguably one of the most iconic bosses of the entire expansion. As this fight takes between 13 to 50 minutes to complete, we will deviate from the normal 3-minute format to really take our time with making sure that we cover everything in detail, as this fight will be where you spend the vast majority of your time in Firelands. The boss has 4 phases and 2 intermission phases. Let's cover the mechanics of each of the phases and how to deal with them appropriately before moving on to the next. For this boss, you want to bring 2 tanks on both 10 and 25 man, 2 healers on 10 man, and 4 healers on 25 man. It's absolutely possible to do this fight with 5 healers, but with the lower gear levels, using 4 healers will ensure you hit certain DPS checks we'll talk about later. Hunters, boomkins, elemental shamans, and arms warriors are extremely good for this fight, so make with that information what you will. As you engage the boss, tank the boss slightly to the right of the center so that you have your melee towards the left. Despite being a stationary boss, he does parry, so keep that in mind when positioning the raid. The rest of your raid should be spread loosely around the left side of the room while making sure the healers are in range of most, if not all, of the raid. On a 30-second interval, the boss will cast Wrath of Ragnaros, which will target the player, do a decent amount of damage to any player within 6 yards of the projectile, and knock them back. This will always target the tank and a few additional targets. His second regular ability in phase 1 is called Hand of Ragnaros, which he does on a 25-second cooldown and does a fairly small amount of damage to everyone in melee while knocking them back. These 2 mechanics you really don't have to pay too much attention to. It's only when a third mechanic, Magma Trap, comes into play that things become a little bit more complicated. Magma Trap is a large flame circle that targets ranged players. Range will have to move away from it ASAP. The first trap will spawn after 16 seconds and then every 25 seconds after that. The large flame circle from the trap will persist on the ground until someone walks into it. You can deal with these traps in 2 ways. You can have your range team perfectly bait the trap into the very edge of the room, overlap them as much as possible, and just let them be up for the rest of the fight. The second way, which I think is more realistic for most people, is to clear the traps by walking into them. Popping a trap will do massive raid-wide damage and knocks the person who walks into them far up into the air. After you pop a trap, you'll have 45-second debuff, increasing your damage taken from subsequent traps. Popping another trap while you have the debuff will all but guarantee a wipe. Since you're spread out when the traps are popped, Aura Mastery offers incredible value in this phase, so having access to 1 or 2 Holy Paladins will be very nice for progression. The best soaker will be a hunter using deterrence before popping the trap. Not only will that immune the damage, but it also prevents them from getting knocked up into the air. Mages using blink right after soaking will also be a good alternative. You want to pay attention to the health of the raid before popping a trap, and you want to have a decent amount of time before the next Wrath of Ragnaros as to not risk damage overlaps. In our raid, we popped our first trap around the 20-second mark with Aura Mastery and AMZ in melee, and the tanks should make sure to have AMS for every trap. We popped the second trap around the 1 minute and 25-second mark, where we have a lot of time before the next Wrath and Hand of Ragnaros. And these are all the traps that will be popped in phase 1. You'll have a total of 4 or 5 traps depending on your DPS, and we'll pop the remainder of the traps during downtime in phase 2, more on that when we get there. During this phase and all subsequent phases, tanks will have to deal with the debuff called Burning Wound. This debuff stacks and does a ticking amount of damage to the tank, but also causes your melee attacks to deal a decent amount of damage through Burning Blast, and this damage is higher the more stacks you have. This damage does not splash to nearby raid members and is merely damage to the boss. If you're running a Feral Druid off tank, it's best to simply have the Feral Druid take over for a few seconds in order for the main tank to drop the stacks and then instantly pick it up again. A good place to tank swap would be the second Hand of Ragnaros, as the boss stops attacking during that point. After the stacks drop, top back and tank it until the intermission. If you're running with a non-Feral Druid off tank, tank swap every 3 stacks, as the debuff will give you Vengeance, and taunting back and forth every 3 stacks will make sure that both tanks are always maxed. Sulfur Smash is the last ability of phase 1. Ragnaros slams down his hammer and shoots waves of fire in 3 90-degree directions. This is extremely easy to avoid, but it requires you to not be asleep on the job. As a melee, you cannot be hit by the fire waves unless you're doing some fancy charge weaving as a warrior. After he picks up his hammer again, there will be a fire patch on the ground for about 5 seconds that does a surprising amount of damage if you walk over it. Once you get the boss to 70%, you will enter the first intermission. Ragnaros will slam his hammer into either the left, right, or middle while spawning 8 adds in somewhat random places. These adds cannot be slowed, but naturally get slowed as you deal damage to them. At 100%, they will have 10 stacks of a speed buff, which reaches 0 once they are at 50% HP. At 50% HP, they move at a snail pace, and you should move on to the next elementals before finishing off the adds. While these adds are not slowable, they are stunnable and can be displaced. Paladins with Glyph of Holy Wrath are fantastic at stunning the mobs. Elemental Shamans and Druids are great goalkeepers as they can knock back any elementals about to reach the hammer. Death Knights with Death Grip are great for stacking up the elementals or potentially to grip an elemental about to reach the hammer. While the adds can spawn in an equal amount on each side, it is more likely for you to have more adds on one side than the other. Split your raid into having 70% of your raid on the long side and 30% on the short side, primarily consisting of strong melee classes with cleave. During this phase, you'll get hit by random lava bolts every 3 seconds, and they hurt more than you think and can be quite difficult to heal up since the raid can be very spread out during this phase. Keep an eye on your health bar and don't be afraid to pop a personal cooldown or health stones in this phase. If you fail to kill the adds in 45 seconds, the remaining adds will explode and all but guarantee a wipe, but assuming you kill them, you enter phase 2. As you enter the phase, pick a spot on either the left or the right side to stack as a raid. Your raid group will be stacked for the entirety of phase 2 as he no longer casts Wrath or Hand of Ragnaros. He will still cast Sulphurous Smash in phase 2, but as you will be stacking in melee, you don't really have to worry about it. The defining mechanic for phase 2 is Molten Seeds. This ability he will cast 15 seconds after the phase starts and every minute after that. You'll have to pay close attention to your raid timers as you'll have to move as a team when the timer reaches 0. Have your raid leader count down from 3.
Moving in 3, 2, 1, go.
So everyone is awake and ideally have a druid cast Stampeding Roar. If you get left behind, you will die from the impact of the seeds. Upon impact, the seeds will grow and after 10.5 seconds, they will explode and do raid-wide damage based on proximity. You'll want to stay around 40 yards away from the seeds in order to be ready to swap to the adds that spawn from the seeds. These adds are immune to stuns and slows as long as they're in proximity of one another and buffs one another with a huge damage increase. As such, it is very important that these die before they reach the raid. There are quite a few things you can do to make this mechanic easier to deal with. The first and perhaps most obvious is for people targeted by the adds to move away from the adds after they spawn to give the raid more time to clear the adds. Second, bring classes that are good at dealing on-demand burst damage at range. Survival Hunters with improved Serpent Sting, Demo Warlocks with Pat Feltstorm, Frosty Gaze with Howling Blast, Elemental Shamans with Earthquake and Chain Lightning, and Druids with Wild Mushroom from both Balance and Resto are some that stands out. Third, send an Arms Warrior to spawn his seed far away from the raid before stacking with the raid. He'll have enough time before the explosion to run over and intervene someone in the raid group, then after the explosion he can leap into the adds, preferably slightly ahead of them, and Bladestorm without having to worry about having an add attacking him. The seed that you spawn will always attack you, and since you spawn it far away as a warrior, it will catch up to you when everything else is dead, and having an unbuffed add hitting you barely does any damage. Fourth, if you're a class like a rogue who can barely touch the adds, stacking up on some big daddies and high-powered bolt guns can help more on the adds than you may think. Dealing with this mechanic correctly is what will allow you to progress through phase 2, so really take some time to figure out how you can nail this mechanic most optimally with your raid comp. Assuming the boss damage is high enough, you'll have to deal with this mechanic 3 times during phase 2. After you dealt with the adds, his other new phase 2 mechanic will happen, which is called Engulfing Flames. This mechanic will light up 1/3 of the room and will do so 4 times, requiring you to dance back and forth to avoid the flames. It's an incredibly easy mechanic to deal with, but you will undoubtedly have a few red members dying to it and absolutely ruin your day. Whether it lights up north, middle, or south is somewhat random, but it will cover each section at least once and one section twice. Standing close to max melee range will allow you to simply move in and out of the north and middle section. After this mechanic, he will cast Sulphurous Smash. Quickly get into melee to get ready for his next seed spawn. Remember those traps from phase 1? Now is an excellent time to pop a trap. You have around 20 seconds until the next seed spawn, which is more than enough time to top off the raid. For the tanks, it's also worth keeping in mind that the boss is not melee during the time he's casting the Engulfing Flame and Reverse Smash sequence, and you will frequently drop stacks naturally at that point. You may have a few seconds left of your stacks after the smash, then simply have your off-tank taunt for 1 or 2 stacks, then take it back. Paying attention to this timing will be more important if you're using a Blood DK and Feral Druid tank combination. In addition to not using melee swings during the Engulfing Flames cast, he also doesn't transition into the next phase while he's casting it. And that means you can get the boss to as close as 40.5% as possible, wait for the next Engulfing Flame cast, and then try to get the boss as low as possible during that cast. Assuming you have somewhat decent DPS, this kind of milking is not really necessary, but can be a good tool to have in your belt if you're struggling with DPS in the 3rd phase due to a mechanic we'll talk about a bit later. In our guild, the boss health seems to naturally line up to be at around 41 to 42% mark when we're done dealing with the 3rd set of seeds, and thus we get a good transition with Engulfing Flames without having to hold DPS. At this point, you'll reach the 2nd intermission. It's the same as the first, except you now also have to deal with 2 new big adds called Lava Scions that will spawn from these 2 locations. Have 1 tank on each side, drag them into the small adds before eventually stacking the 2. These adds have a debuff called Blazing Heat that they will place on a non-tank target. This debuff will leave a flame patch underneath your location, and it's your duty to drop it away from the raid. If the small adds walk over these patches, they will heal for 10% of their HP every second. You want to have these big adds as low as possible before entering the 3rd phase, and since the transition happens whenever all small adds are dead, you want to keep 1 add alive for as long as possible. Mark an add, get it low, but don't kill it until the boss is about to hit the 45-second softened rage timer. Don't be afraid to use grips and knocks to get it away from the raid. As you enter phase 3, have your off-tank taunt the big adds if they're not dead, as your main tank takes over the boss. Split your raid into a left side team and a right side team. How you split the raid is not super important, other than that you should have the tanks on the one side and melee on the other side. In this phase, you'll have to deal with Sulfurous Smash and Engulfing Flames, just like in the previous phase, but Engulfing Flames will happen much more frequently. The only other mechanic of this phase is Summon Living Meteor, which spawns a Living Meteor. This happens every 45 seconds and essentially serves as your soft and rage for this phase. The first cast spawns 1, second cast spawns 1, but 3rd cast spawns 2. And since these meteors stay with you into phase 4, having 4 of them up makes the last phase pretty much impossible to deal with. As such, during progression, this is where you want to use your lust and your second pot and go to town. Meteors will target a specific raid member and roll towards him. It cannot be slowed or stunned, but a direct hit will knock it back. After a knockback, the meteor will become immune to knockbacks for 6 seconds before you can do it again. The meteor have a fire shield of sorts once it's ready to be knocked. Once the boss reaches 10% HP, he will no longer spawn meteors, but will stick around for a while before submerging in preparation of phase 4. The damage that you do here to the boss does have an impact on the next phase, so don't stop DPSing just because you hit 10%. During this time, you'll also want to have kited the meteors to the entrance, far away from Rag. Then, after some brief downtime, Rag comes back up for his heroic-only phase, this time with legs. The only mechanic to stick around from the previous phases is the tank debuff, but you don't have to worry about tank swapping in this phase. Stacks will drop naturally during a mechanic we'll talk about later. During this phase, the entire raid will take damage from Superheated and gain a stacking damage buff as long as they're taking damage from the spell. This is countered by standing in a frost patch. There will always be at least 1 frost patch up, assuming you're playing the fight correctly, and as such, this is a mechanic that you don't really have to put too much thought into. We'll also ideally like to have a maximum of 2 meteors up during this phase. Do your best to keep knocking them away from your location, and if you're targeted, move out of the raid to bait the meteors away. Once you get your second frost patch spawn, roughly 1 minute into the fight, you need to kite one of the orbs into a frost patch. Once it enters it, it will get frozen and can now be attacked. Every DPS should hard swap to the meteor to ensure that it dies as soon as it gets frozen. Once it's dead, everyone in the raid can move over to the new frost patch. You'll do the same thing once the 3rd frost patch spawns with the 2nd meteor. The main tank mechanic of phase 4 is Empowered Sulfurous. After 1 minute 20 and every 55 seconds after that, Rag will empower his hammer, and if anyone gets hit by a melee attack, he will instantly wipe the raid. Luckily, you'll have these huge green circles which will stun Rag if he's kited into it, removing the empowerment and increasing damage taken by 50% during the duration. This is extremely easy to deal with. Simply have your main tank on the boss at all times, then when the trap spawns, the off tank will run out, position himself by the trap, and taunt once the boss gets empowered. The boss will then run towards the trap and get rooted right away. Main tank taunts back the boss and everything goes back to normal. There is a chance that the trap spawns right on the Rag. It is crucial that you nitro boost out of the trap before it fully forms. Otherwise, he will get rooted before he empowers his hammer, and that means big trouble. His last mechanic of this phase is also the one that will serve as a bit of a softened rage, and that is Dread Flames. Dread Flames spawns fire patches throughout the room and keep spreading unless they're dealt with. You deal with these fires by having one person on 10 man and 3 people on 25 man get the buff Deluge by clicking a water buff that's spawned by Malfurion Stormrage. The people who click this buff will be firefighters, and their main responsibility is to make sure the room is as clean as possible. The best candidates for this will be either hunters with Aspect Tushita, shamans with Ghost Wolf, or feral druids with Feral Swiftness. As a rule of thumb, always prioritize fires close to the frost patches, then new spawns, then fire in the middle area, and then lastly fire towards the edges if there is nothing else to clean. Your main priority is to clean fire during this phase, and your damage is secondary. With the Deluge buff, you become immune to fire damage, so no need to worry about dying in this phase. And that's essentially it. Clear fire, kite the hammer, freeze meteors, and that's how you kill Ragnaros on Heroic. This was a damn long video, so if you stuck around until the end, make sure to subscribe to the channel and to watch the rest of the Firelands guides on the screen right now.